Welcome back, everyone. Today we are just about done with Farron. Before we head back into the muck and mire, though, I want to make some equipment adjustments. Now that we have the full set, it seems like a good idea to demo the antiquated set. It's a far cry from the days when it used to be the best leg armor in Dark Souls 1, but it's still rather easy on the eyes.
Ah, well met, Ashen One. How may I be of service? Ashen One, what woeful umbral ash is this? This barren dust, stuff of a fool, won't yield aught. Where didst thou happen upon the stuff? Tell me for the sport. Oh yes, I see. Clinging to lofty dreams in this dying world, more's the pity. It must come from one most foolish indeed. Wouldst thou not agree?
The handmaiden is somewhat incorrect on this point. I have nothing to say about whether or not it's useless to hold on to lofty dreams in this dying world, but these barren ashes, the stuff of a fool, do yield titanite shards, so empirically speaking, they're pretty valuable.
Ashen One, be sure to bring more souls.
Still, you gotta know better than to argue with your elders sometimes.
Ah, there you are, unkindled one. I am pleased to have a pupil as dedicated as you. If you seek pyromancy tomes, take this sage advice. The lands of the lords converge upon Lothric. The home of pyromancy's drifts comparatively close as well. At least, that is what pyromancers of the Great Swamp believe. The place is called Izalith. Oh, how I wish to behold a primal pyromancy. Well, these are old tales. No one knows where the truth begins or ends.
If Cornix knew the truth, he would likely be less interested in Lost Izalith. But I see no reason to disillusion him. Either way, I feel comfortable spending some large titanite shards on my pyromancy flame. It's quite valuable.
Back again, I see. Perfect timing, too. I'm in need of a diversion. Oh my. Well, this is very unusual. It's from Ulysses, an ancient land of golden sorceries. Not even the Dragon School possesses such a long-lost scroll. What would the Xanthus scholars say with their ridiculous headwear?
They would simply slaver over this find.
As I mentioned earlier, Ulysses is notable for being home to sorceries that don't necessarily do a lot of damage, or any damage at all, but instead focus on utility. We have a spell that can repair our weapons, reflect magic, turn us invisible, and even hide our weapon. I don't have an infinite number of souls here, so I'm trying to be a little bit more judicious about what I buy. But in the end,
Come again.
it doesn't matter all that much. The golden sorceries won't necessarily win you a fight, but they can help you get there in some surprising ways. Cast light also just helps you out in general, because it cast light in dark places. Sometimes you don't want to have to sacrifice one hand for a torch. Doesn't come up all too often in 3, but it's quite a useful tool in 2. I'm happy to announce that we are more or less done with being poisoned, so I can take Caressing Tears off of my spell bar. Make a bit of a blunder here by taking both Enchanted Weapon and Enchanted Shield. It'll become apparent why that's a blunder a little later. Now that we've doused all 3 flames, we can make a beeline right to where we need to be. I should note, actually, that as I went through this area, I've noticed upon reflection that I actually missed the stone parma. So I'll have to go back and get that a bit later. It's one of the most stable medium shields in the game, so it's worth picking up. I don't know why exactly I forgot it. I think I was a little distracted by all the technical difficulties. Some more Corvians live on this path, but if you're paying attention to your surroundings, you can get the drop on them fairly effectively and take out their shaman before it even becomes an issue. There's a word that I'm never quite sure how to pronounce. I've heard it said both ways, shaman and shaman. I believe their official name is storyteller, so I'll just try and stick with that from now on. It's longer, but I know how to pronounce it. We can faintly hear the click of basilisks down below, but fortunately we don't have to bother with them. Now here's something a bit rare. We've got some enemy infighting in this area. The Gru are up against 2 angry Dark Wraiths, and this is a fight they will usually lose. It's also one that you will likely lose too if you're not careful, because 2 of these Dark Wraiths at once is extremely difficult to deal with. Even an Enchanted Shield won't save you, because their Dark Hand grab attack comes out extremely quickly. Quickly enough to the point that I'm quite envious of it. I've experimented with the Dark Hand myself on occasion, and have found it generally lacking. Kiting them backwards is an effective strategy, and so is separating them. You can also attempt to engage them while they're fighting the Gru, but it's actually difficult to do so when you're approaching from below. That even had the backstab animation and everything. They're really weird in this game sometimes. Still, a victory is a victory, though we're a little worse for the wear. It still kind of peeves me a little bit that Dark Eye orbs are so easy to come by in this game when you get a full, completely functional one almost without effort. Why couldn't they drop this much in Dark Souls 2? Huh? Why? Life is hard. This bonfire on the outer wall provides a very useful waypoint for our journey. The next boss is actually right up ahead, though there's a bit of optional stuff I want to explore first, both for posterity and for some useful items. The Dark Wraiths are very effective against the Grue, but they are not actually particularly thorough. Even if you leave them to their own devices for a lengthy period of time, there will still be some Grue lurking in the background that can take you by surprise. This area is actually quite popular for farming. The reason being, both the Grue and the Dark Wraiths have a chance of dropping Covenant items. The Dark Wraiths can grant Pale Tongues, and the Grue can drop, Swordwolf Grass as well. Given that the enemies more or less kill themselves, you can just sort of wait in the background and let them farm themselves. It's rather convenient if you want to level up those Covenants without actually dealing with any multiplayer stuff. Which, given how spotty connectivity can be in this game, and actually getting a bite is, you know, it's a valid strategy. To say nothing of dried ears. We'll return to this fellow in a bit. He is somewhat important. As I mentioned, before we really move on, we do want to explore this wing of the swamp. Though at this point it's not much of a swamp and it's more of a proper keep. One can only assume that before things started going bad around here, more of this structure was actually like above ground and not underneath the muck and mire. I mentioned earlier that it was a bit of an error to take both magic shield and magic weapon, and this is why. With my current setup, in fact I think with most setups, you can't actually have both active at once because you will need to switch at some point for a catalyst. I thought I could get around this by using the Cleric's Candlestick, but it turns out I can't actually, like, enchant that. It's complicated. If you want to have both, really, just use some form of sap. Some pine resin. Sticky white stuff. That's Demon Souls, I'm sorry. I think it's pale pine resin in this game. That's sort of a moot point for this area because that ravenous crystal lizard actually takes very little damage from magic type damage. So, you know. By exploring down this way, we actually get a nice little shortcut from here to the Road of Sacrifices. It's not especially useful because there's a bonfire right there and you can just sort of warp with impunity, but, you know, it's nice to have an interconnected map. That was one of the things that many people thought Souls 2 was lacking, and I would agree to a certain extent. You might have spotted these items when we were exploring the swamp earlier, and at the time there was no way to get them. Dropping down from above, however, is the way that you reach them, so at the time it was true. However, I have very little interest in actually getting back through the swamp, so I'm just going to use a homeward bone to get back to where we were. Now that I've realized the error of my magic allotment, I'm going to do a couple of tweaks to what spells I'm carrying. Maybe even show off some new ones. The problem with magic in this game is just a lot of spells are not very good. Another problem is that I'm very indecisive. I decide to only take 3 with me and switch out my rings a little bit. I take off one of the rings that gives me an extra attunement slot and switch it out for a damage boosting ring. Inventory management is fascinating, I know. Still, you spend quite a bit of time in menus in this game. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I also switch out my set for more physical protection, because we're going to be needing it where we're going. The Firekeeper set is hardly heavy armor, but it does do a better job of the antiquated set. This is probably the best way to deal with the Dark Wraiths. If you can, get one to break off and attack you while the other one goes to handle the Grue. Dealing with one at a time is much easier, both for you and the Grue up ahead, meaning that they will have a better shot of actually dealing with the Dark Wraith up there. It's still a fairly one-sided fight unless a couple of specific things happen, but Dark Wraiths are pretty serious business. Fortunately, I believe these are the last 2 that we encounter in the game unless we return here. Their Dark Hand shield does not fully block all damage, and it's fairly weak in terms of stability, so if you hammer on it enough, you can get them to stagger. The problem with that strategy is that they'll usually drop it of their own accord to counterattack, and because of their high poise, you might find yourself in a situation where you find yourself trading blows where you're not on the winning side of the trade. It's best to play conservatively against those kinds of enemies. Dark Wraiths are very adept at punishing impatience. It sounds like somebody's almost hammering on an anvil in there or something. You must have caught these 2 napping. They're not very observant. Now, I mentioned this summon before. Blackhand Goddard is a NPC summon that will always appear here. He is important, not necessarily because he's very helpful, or because he's important to the story, but because he gives you a gesture. By my sword. There are several NPCs like that who will actually give you gestures if you summon them. But on to graver matters. These are the Abyss Watchers of Farron's undead legion. They were noted in the opening for being one of the Lords of Cinder, despite the fact that being multiple people, it would be quite difficult for them to mutually be a lord. That might put some insight into why they're killing each other in this chamber. The Abyss Watchers fight with a unique style and also with the strength of superior numbers. As the fight progresses, more will rise from the grave and join the fight against you. However, there's also a downside to them for this. Some of the Abyss Watchers will arise with red eyes, which signifies that they will attack their own. They can still attack you, of course, but they provide a welcome distraction and a fairly appreciable source of damage. Since the Abyss Watchers are nominally human-sized, you can backstab them and riposte them if you're skilled enough. Backstabbing is easier, especially if you have somebody distracting them, like a Red-Eye Knight or Goddard. Once you deplete the boss's first health bar, the Abyss Watchers then enter their second phase, their Lord of Cinder form. In this form, they dispense with the numbers tactics and instead imbue all of their power into a single Abyss Watcher. This serves the purpose of igniting their Farron Greatsword, and generally making that Abyss Watcher tougher and more capable. This can be a difficult fight depending on your setup and how you approach the first phase. If you got through it without expending an awful lot of resources, then you'll be in okay shape here, but this can also be a nasty surprise. The fire trails are actually somewhat reminiscent of the fight with Lady Maria in Bloodborne, and can be dealt with in a similar way. The explosions and after images left by the fire are quite difficult to deal with in some cases, though, especially since you're lacking the advanced mobility that Bloodborne tends to give you. It's best to go ahead and take them out aggressively at this point. They don't have exceptionally a lot of health in this form, so simply going for a damage race is not the worst idea if you're having trouble actually dodging their attacks. Demonstrating the by my sword gesture. With that, we've slain our first Lord of Cinder, the Abyss Watchers. It seemed perhaps that the blood they shared was more lord than they were. No doubt the folks back home will be interested in learning of our progress.
Hello again. I have since heard a great deal about you. For one, that you are most gentle of heart. I, too, am bound by duty, but can offer you my sign. I hear that cordial intrusion lays the path to embers. If I can be of help, by all means, do call upon me. Blessing of the moon upon your journey. If you should require assistance, use my sign, Blessing of the moon upon your journey.
Sirius briefly returns, and so does this dour fellow.
I know you. Been some time. I just dropped in to see how she's getting on. Now, what are you playing at with this circus? This cesspool of doddering old folk and degenerates? Couldn't be better. She must fit in perfectly here. This place is a cesspool of doddering old folk and degenerates. Couldn't hope for better. She must fit in perfectly here.
Christ, what an asshole.
You oft the Lords of Cinder, the undead legion. So that's how they're delivered to their thrones. I pity the sorry souls. Is that really Lordship's last reward? I failed to thank you for helping them find their final resting place. I pity the sorry souls. Is that really Lordship's last reward?
Deserter he may be, Hawkwood still doesn't take the news particularly well. He tries to laugh it off, but you can tell that he's hurting.
Aha, thou returned, and a fine day it is. So, most illustrious Lord Seeker, or should I say, Lord Slayer? Fine kindling for the thrones, is it not? Each soul truly worthy of lordship. And all slain by thy hand, to bind them to their thrones, even in death. Oh, I have no qualms, for as we are to our thrones, thou art to thy duty. In fact, methinks thou'st helped these poor lords along their rightful path.
In addition to offering some new wares from our acquired souls, Ludlith also is fairly okay with our somewhat bloodthirsty destiny. While I'm here, I'm going to grab a couple things. Boulder, at least, will be quite fun.
Now, do not be away over long.
Before we close out, we have one last thing to do. Our task would mean nothing if we did not deliver the ashes to the throne. It is a poor reward, but perhaps they can find some peace in the hereafter.